Carpetbaggers by Kofax. Chapter 3. Sometime around midnight, one of the clan Mother Pekana's grandsons came to relieve Lucy. She wasn't strong enough to work on the great pumps further down, and had been pumping with the dwarves on one of the shallower levels, mud caked to her knees and her feet cramping in the cold water. When the young dwarf touched her shoulder, she jumped, startled. The poor light from a stub of a candle wasn't enough to illuminate more than the occasional sweat-shiny face, but he didn't argue when he waved her away from the pump handle, for she was numb with exhaustion and desperate to curl up somewhere warm and dry. Another dwarf pulled her away from the pump handle and towed her staggering up the stairway into the great stone cavern that was the main entrance to the Pattering Hill mines. There were lanterns there, and the air was warmer. Lucy just leaned against the rough wall for a few minutes, letting the heat soak in. She thought she might have cried a little. She wasn't sure. Finally, someone lifted her hand and wrapped it around a cup of something warm. Lucy opened her eyes to see Pekana watching her, head tilted sideways. "Thank you," she mumbled and struggled to lift the small cup to her mouth. It was tea, black, stewed, and bitter, and completely wonderful. When she tried to hand the mug back, she couldn't seem to open her hand, though. It was so stiff from the work she had been doing. Pekana took the cup from her hand and frowned. "How old are you, child?" Lucy wanted to protest that she was a queen, but she remembered in time that they weren't going to talk about that. "9, she said. "Lion's mane, and we've put you to work in the deeps!" Pekana looked outraged. "Pegleaf, take this child to the bunk rooms and put her to bed. We will not work children like grown men." Another dwarf, one of the girls, Lucy thought, although the girls and boys dressed the same in rough blue or red tunics, dropped a curtsy to Pekana and tugged gently at Lucy's sleeve. "This way," she said, and Lucy followed her through a doorway and down a hall to a low wooden door. She didn't remember changing her clothes or climbing under the stretchy blankets in a dwarf-sized bed. A dwarf-sized bed is very small indeed, too small even for Lucy unless she curled up tightly. When she awoke, she was warm and dry, and her sister's face was smashed into her shoulder. Lucy shifted sideways and sat up, careful not to disturb Susan. They were in a small room, with beds arrayed along the walls, one atop the other. At the end of the room was a window through which Lucy saw bright sun illuminating several gray and white geese on a green lawn. About half the beds were occupied, and next to her own bed she saw a pile of filthy clothing. Based on the color, she decided it was Susan's. Her stomach growled, and she realized she didn't remember eating since lunch yesterday, when they had finished the last of the cold rabbits. No wonder she was hungry. She swung her feet out of bed and realized she was wearing a dwarf girl's dress, which was too short for her, and her breeches and boots were gone. Well, she could hardly stay in bed, after all. She turned and looked at Susan, but her sister was deep asleep, her hands still clenched as though wrapped around a pump handle. She must have worked half the night, and the boys might still be down there. Lucy left the room and followed the sound of voices. She found herself in the same room where they'd met the clan mother yesterday, but now it was full of dwarves carrying dishes and platters. She realized, standing in the doorway, that they were clearing away from a meal. She looked mournfully at a bowl of something as it went past. "Oh, you're one of the humans. Do you want something to eat?" A dwarf girl looked at her with friendly attention, a far cry from yesterday's suspicion. "Oh, yes, please!" Within half a minute, Lucy was seated at the table with a bowl of something and a mug of tea. She was too big for the cups to be very useful, and the dwarf girl finally brought her a small serving pitcher to drink from, which worked much better. The work continued on around them, but the dwarf girl who had spoken to her sat down across the table and watched, while Lucy ate something dark and crunchy and savory. "What is this?" Lucy said once she felt less like a starving lion. "I've never had it before." "Seaweed," said the dwarf. "We collect it at Black Point, and it doesn't need summer to grow. It's very good for you, although it is boring if you have it every day." She grimaced. "Seaweed?" Lucy was startled. She'd heard that one could eat it, but she'd never imagined doing so. "What else do you eat?" "Fish. Lots of fish," said the dwarf with some distaste. "And eggs from the chickens, and sometimes goat, or goat cheese. Once a ship from Kalaman ran aground just off Black Point. There were these funny round fruits, bright green, with the most wonderful orange insides, so sweet and juicy. My gran says that when she was a little girl they had fruit all the time." She looked skeptical. Lucy hastened to reassure her. "But the summer is here now. There will be fruit again, all kinds. I even saw cherry trees blossoming and oh, you will love cherries. The dwarf girl looked impressed and opened her mouth to ask something, but they were interrupted by Edmund's voice. No? He stood at the door looking half asleep and entirely silly in a dwarf-sized robe, which only came partway down his thighs. Do you know where our clothes are? Lucy jumped up and grabbed his hand. Ed, come and eat. Do you know they have seaweed for breakfast? No, don't worry, it's lovely. And they've only ever had fresh fruit once. All right. He grumbled, but sat down when she pushed him. Oh, you, he said around a mouthful. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't even ask, Lucy said. I'm Lucy, and this is Edmund. The dwarf smiled. I am Panna, and my sister Pagleaf helped you to bed last night, though I don't think you remember. How was the pumping? Lucy asked Edmund. Is it done? Oh, no, said Panna, her smile dropping away. There is still so much water, it will be days yet before... She stopped speaking and looked down at the table. After a long moment, she said, They must be so cold and frightened. Edmund put his spoon down. Your uncle? My father and my cousins, she said. They were trapped 4 days ago when the water rose suddenly. I was told when I was young that Aslan wouldn't fail us. The mothers always said that he would come back and save us from the witch. But the only reason they are trapped is because of the summer and the snowmelt now. Hannah broke off, looking horrified at what she had said. Is that tea? Edmund reached across and grabbed the pitcher. He took a long drink and then another, although it was cold by now. He was staring into the air. When Lucy turned to see what he was looking at, she saw only a blank wall. Finally, he finished off the tea in a series of swallows, and then put the pitcher down with a decisive thump. Right, let's go find the others. I've got an idea. Peter was a heavy sleeper at the best of times, and the morning after spending hour after hour in snowmelt to your thighs, throwing your weight against an ancient rusting pump assembly in the cold darkness was far from the best of times. So Edmund was not entirely surprised that it took Peter rather longer than everyone else to emerge from the bunk room they had been guided to after their shift on the pumps ended. The rest of them, Edmund, Lucy and Susan, Rhea, Pekana, Panna, and Pekana's son Radnoff, were all outside in the sun for several minutes before Peter staggered out the door, his face bleary and hair sticking straight up on one side. He had one of the beer pitchers in his hands, and Edmund hoped it was full of tea. Good, Edmund said, and turned back to Radnolf. You're sure they were here? He pointed to a spot on the large parchment drawing Radnolf had laid out on the ground. And not here. He tapped with his forefinger another spot, one at a lower elevation. I'm sure. Radnolf wasn't cheerful and talkative like his niece, or cynical and knowing like his mother. He was, Edmund decided, phlegmatic, a radio play's idea of a dwarf, down to the hobnail boots and coal dust ground into his hands. They meant to go to the North Oak Seam and work there until sunset. Peter nudged Edmund's shoulder with his knee, and Ed shifted over so Peter could sit down and get a view of the plans. What are you planning, Ed? Asked Peter in what he probably imagined was a calm voice. It sounded more like he was about to bite someone's head off, and Edmund was relieved when Susan answered him. Peter and Mornings rarely got along. We are planning a rescue, she said. As efficient as ever, Susan had managed to bring or find clean clothes that fit her. She was wearing a dark green tunic and a brown split skirt. Edmund tried not to notice the way his own knees stuck out under his too short dwarf tunic. At least Peter didn't look any better. None of the dwarf clothes would fit him, and he was entirely wrapped in a blanket. I see. Peter leaned over the plans, tracing the same line Edmund had been looking at, while his other hand held the blanket together. What's the distance here? He asked, looking up at Radnolf. The dwarf tugged at his beard thoughtfully. 30 yards, maybe 40. He said. Lucy shook her head. That's awfully far. Mightn't the water have gone down? Maybe, Edmund said, but we can't count on it. He kept studying the drawing, looking for another option. Rhea stretched a long nose over the parchment before sitting up straight again. Her muzzle wrinkled. It will be dark on the other side, and they'll be panicky. You'll have to keep your head about you. Edmund looked up at that, but Rhea wasn't talking to him. She was looking at Susan. Actually, he said, but Peter cut him off. She's right, it has to be Susan. She's the strongest swimmer of all of us. But Susan folded her arms and gave him bad luck. But what, Ed? But we'll need a really long rope. It'll be heavy, he warned. I'm cold, added Lucy, and shivered theatrically, although they were warm in the sun. Pecana folded her arms across her chest and stared down at the drawing, then up at Susan, frowning. I would not have you do this if we were not children of Earth. Water will not carry us the way it does you humans. We will owe you a great debt if you save even one of my people. She didn't sound happy about that indebtedness, although Edmund suspected that was mostly for effect. Edmund glanced at Peter, who was keeping his expression neutral. No, his brother wasn't beyond exploiting a tragedy for a little political gain. But to be fair, they would have made the offer anyway. Having Pecana owe them was just icing on the cake. We don't care about that, protested Lucy. We just want to help. Then we should begin, said Pecana. Waiting out here will make it no warmer in the workings, and they have waited long enough in the cold dark. If they are still alive, went unsaid. Edmund climbed to his feet, still feeling yesterday's long hike and longer stint at the pumps, and was shamefully grateful that he wasn't the one going into the water. Susan was a strong swimmer, but this wasn't going to be much like the 100-yard breaststroke at the school swimming gala. You'll need rope, he said, thinking out loud. And grease. And robes, Susan added, turning to Panna. The warmest ones you can find. Lanterns, so we can see the light through the water, and tunnel 12 more dwarves to help. The next half hour was a flurry of activity as they pulled together supplies and recruited volunteers to help bring everything down into the mines. Someone found clothing for Edmund and Peter, and if it looked a bit like a woman's dress with the hem let down, Edmund wasn't going to say anything if Peter didn't. He found himself walking next to Susan, carrying a lantern behind Pecana as she led the way through the tunnels. In the uncertain bobbing light, Susan looked only a little concerned, as though she were thinking about a maths problem. Except when Edmund touched her hand with his, she grabbed it and held on tight for the rest of the way. All too soon, the low, wide tunnel turned and cut downhill, and the sound and smell of water met them. The air was dank and cool, but still warmer than the water was. Edmund's bare feet cramped up as they stepped into it. The ground here was relatively smooth, but uneven enough that he stubbed his toes 3 times before learning to pick his knees up high at each step, splashing water as he did so. There were voices all around, people talking quietly or warning one another of obstacles as they followed the tunnel northward for a few 100 yards, past the occasional glimmer of gemstone or seam of precious metal. These mines were enormous, but then from what Panna had said, the dwarves had been here for generation upon generation. And they'd spent the last 100 years huddled inside with nothing to do but extend the workings even farther and deeper. Edmund tried to think about what the dwarves would be able to trade in the future in order to keep his mind off his numb feet, but it didn't really work. How could Susan possibly swim through this if Edmund could barely walk in it? But she still looked determined, striding along through the water, clad in a sleeveless shirt and breeches, with nearly all of her exposed skin covered in a thick layer of goose grease. The dwarves in the kitchens had not been happy about that, but Pecana had overruled them. At last the company drew to an awkward halt, and there was some shuffling about as the dwarves made way for Susan. She let go of Edmund's hand and went forward without looking at him to meet Pecana and Radnoff, where the roof of the tunnel began to cut sharply downward. Just a few yards away was the spot where the rock of the ceiling disappeared into the water. "Sue," said Peter, and began uncoiling rope, the finest line they could find. He looped it around her chest and shoulders, tying it together in the middle of her back, and left the rest of it piled in Radnolf's arms. She shrugged her shoulders and raised her hands toward the ceiling, checking her movement. "That's good," she said quietly. "Double-check the knot, Ed?" Peter snorted, and Ed smirked, but did as he was asked. There was an old family story about Peter and knots. It took 20 minutes to tell, and always ended with a cheer for Edmund. Mr. Pevensey liked to tell it at the holidays, and Peter always blushed scarlet. "It's solid." There was a splash as Lucy threw herself at Susan, but Susan caught her arms and held her off, careful of the grease, protecting her. "Be careful," Lucy whispered. Aslan protect you, Queen Susan. He will, Susan assured her and gently pushed her into Peter's arms. She nodded at her brothers and to Picana, and then took a great breath, then another. There was no room for a proper dive, so she took 3 fast steps and threw herself into the water. Within moments, the only movement in the cave was the ripple of water against the tunnel walls and the quick shuffle of Red and Elf paying out line. Now all they could do was wait. She had never been this cold! Not even those first days in Narnia in the snow. Then they had furs, and within just a day or so, the snow had melted and the air had been warm and full of promise. But this cold sank into Susan's muscles, into her bones, slowing her strokes, dulling her brain. This was the kind of cold that killed. 30 yards. 30 yards was only a little farther than the length of the pool. She could swim the length of the pool without coming up for air. Had done so dozens of times during swimming practice. She was strong. She had won prizes for her swimming, and Narnia made her stronger. She could do this. Lives were depending on it. But this was not a school baths, with lane markers and clear light illuminating everything. This was a lightless tunnel hundreds of feet underground with no crowd cheering for her and nothing to see in the darkness, not even the pale flicker of her own hands as she stroked forward through the frigid water. The water tasted like minerals on her lips, and it felt thick through her fingers like mud rather than liquid. She wasn't moving fast enough, and she kicked harder, losing the smooth rhythm of her stroke. She forced herself to even it out. She couldn't afford to panic. The dwarves at the other side of this tunnel, if they were alive at all, were just as cold and miserable as she was. But the tunnel was endless. What if she got lost? What if she had turned around and wouldn't reach the air again? She didn't want to die here in the cold and dark by herself. Her air was beginning to run thin, her strokes becoming ragged. The urge to breathe, just open her mouth and gasp for air, was becoming desperate. She let herself move upwards and scraped her hand on the rock of the ceiling. She wasn't there yet. It was too far. She had been so sure she could do it. Aslan, Susan Pavinci thought, as if the line could come to her here, lost in dark water, and saw a light flickering up ahead. She kicked hard, arrowing towards that intermittent gleam. One last burst of effort, and she came gasping up into the open air. She blinked the water out of her eyes, seeking the light, but it was completely dark. The light she had seen was gone. She wondered if it had been there at all. Hey! There was a shout nearby and more voices, but Susan ignored them, just letting herself breathe, drawing the blessed air into her lungs. At last she spat out some water and said, Is that Ricald? Are you here? The voices clamored again, and finally one of them shouted the others down. Oi, that's me, girl! There are 4 of us yet alive! 4, which meant one of his dwarves had died. Susan stroked towards the voices and fumbled her way across a narrow rock shelf. My name is Susan. I'm here to get you out. Several of them cried out in relief, but one of them laughed, a harsh sound in the darkness. You? A slip of a girl. The stone under her hands was crumbly and rough, but she followed it up and, oh, thank Aslan, out of the water entirely. It didn't seem any warmer, though. She couldn't see the light she had seen through the water, but she could hear the 4 dwarves around her and smell their bodies in the tight space. Yes, I'm a girl, but I'm strong enough for this, she said, finding it hard to form the words. Her lips and mind both were still slow from the cold. You'll have to untie me, I can't reach the knots, she added. Anything to get out of here, said Ricald, and she felt his hands go fumbling up her body. When he reached her hips, he gasped and his hands fell away. You're no dwarf! Lucky for you, she said, and sank to her knees to let him reach the knot at her back. Here, undo the knots on my back so we can use the rope for you. There was some grumbling from the latter, whose name Susan found out was Bandorf, but within a short time Susan had been untied. The darkness tangled them up, and after a few minutes fumbling she had roped the 4 dwarves in a line with Ricard at the front. You understand? You will have to kick too, she said again, leading, or pushing, the 4 dwarves into the water. They were afraid. Dwarves were not naturally swimmers, and once in the tunnel there would be no air. She tried not to think about that. Take some deep breaths and go deep in the water so you don't hit your head on the roof. You can do it. Your families are waiting for you on the other side. They will pull you through. Just hold your breaths and kick as hard as you can. With that, she picked up the rope in front of Recalled and gave it a great heave, walking it back through the water to make sure Peter got the signal through the tunnel. If he didn't... But he did. Just as she let go of the rope, she felt it began to move. "Down!" she shouted to them as the dwarves were pulled past her, crying out and splashing before they disappeared. She hoped they listened to her and imagined them kicking one another in the face as they were towed through the tunnel. She was truly alone now, without even the rope for a guide. She had better be careful here in the dark, or she would be utterly lost. And she was suddenly so very tired. She knew she should dive into the tunnel and swim back, but instead she went back to the ledge and climbed out onto the dry land. Now the dwarves were gone, it was silent in the cave. She couldn't even hear any water dripping. The stone was rough underneath her, but she couldn't feel it. Her skin was numb with cold, and her hands were stiff with it, so cold she couldn't bend her fingers. She shouldn't have stopped moving. There was no way she could warm up here. She had to go back through the tunnel. But her legs and arms ached. Her eyes hurt from the strain of looking at the complete darkness. And the blankets and hot drinks on the other side of the tunnel seemed so far away. It would be so hard to go back into the water. Lucy was waiting for her. Lucy, who had called her Queen Susan, as though she truly were, and Edmund and Peter, who had trusted her to be strong enough to save these lives and wise enough to negotiate with Picano when they had arrived. Even Rhea, who had treated her as a real person, not someone caught halfway between child and adult. Blankets and hot drinks, and Aslan, who had demanded this of her. Susan stumbled forward into the water again, took a deep breath, and dove back into the tunnel. The rope was soaking wet, so much heavier than it had been when Peter carried it down into the mine. Now he hauled it up out of the water, working in unison with Ed and the dozen dwarves behind him, hoping the weight of it was the missing dwarves, alive and healthy. But the rope ran down into the water, following the line of the rock ceiling, and as they pulled, it came slower and harder. The light from the lanterns was poor, but Peter could feel the surface of the rope was ragged, torn by the way they were dragging it across the rock. If the rope survived being towed against the rough and jagged surface of the tunnel ceiling, Peter wasn't entirely sure the dwarves would. "Heave!" he cried, and they pulled the rope as one, then walked their hands up it, and heave! And so they worked their way along the line. It was so much longer now than it was when they fed it out after Susan. Surely the dwarves must be through the tunnel by now. And then suddenly there they were, dark heads popping up out of the water as he pulled. 1, 2, 3, 4. The first one began shouting, but the tunnel was suddenly echoing with cheers and whoops that Peter couldn't hear him. He kept pulling, and then they were in reach, and Peter stepped deeper into the water to help the first of them up. "Recalled!" shouted Picana, and rushed forward, tripping over the rope and nearly sending herself into the deeps. She hugged her son, but then had to pull away so the other dwarfs could come to shore and be freed from the tangled mess Susan had made of their knots. The next few moments were a chaos of unbinding and dwarf chatter as the families celebrated and the rescued tried to tell their stories, and blankets and mugs of tea were passed around. Only after the last of them was freed and passed up the tunnel towards dry ground did Peter turn and look back into the water. Susan should have followed right behind the dwarfs. That had been the plan. "Where is she?" asked Lucy. "I don't know." There was a touch on Peter's arm. He looked down to see Picana watching him. He looked away. The light from their torches and lamps rippled on the surface of the still water, and something dripped. And they said nothing. Peter clenched his fists, suppressing the urge to leap into the water and search for Susan. It seemed a long time, but it was only a few moments later when there was a soft pop and a gasp. "Susan!" called Edmund, and Peter heard splashing. "Help her!" commanded Lucy, her face white with fear. Peter flung himself into the water at last, gasping with shock as the cold hit, and thrashed forward until he felt his hand catch in his sister's hair. She was floating on the surface, and he felt her move, but she couldn't seem to swim any further. "Sue, it's me!" he said, and pulled her over onto her back so he could tow her to shore. She didn't say anything, and barely reacted even when they came within reach of the others and were pulled up onto the shore. Picana touched Susan's face and neck and announced, She's still chilled. We must get her up into the heat and dry her off. Can you carry her?" It took Peter a few heartbeats to realize she was talking to him. "I can try," he said, although it had been years since he'd given Sue a piggyback ride. "Help me get her up, Ed." And between the two of them, they heaved Susan up into his arms. Her drenched hair hung loose, swaying as he walked, and her face was very pale. In latter days, he didn't remember much of that journey out of the mines, just flashes of exhaustion, bitter water on his legs, and fear for Susan. Edmund and Lucy walked next to him and behind him to steady him when he faltered or Susan slipped. It was less than a mile, but it felt like hours as the tunnel stretched down before him, dark and chill beyond the reach of the lantern light. At length they came into the great cavern, but Bacana shepherded them forward out of the compound altogether and into the sun. It was perhaps 3 hours since they had sat here on the grass in front of the dining hall, and the sun was still well above the trees. Mid-afternoon, perhaps. Rhea was there waiting. She jumped up and came to them, sniffing at Susan's face as Peter carefully laid her down on the robe Bacana spread for him. In the sunlight, Susan looked blue, her eyes sunken. Nasty scrapes marked her shoulder and the side of her face, as though she had run into the tunnel wall at one point. Bacana snapped orders, and someone came running with hot stones wrapped in cloth and a pitcher of tea. "Take those clothes off her," she told Lucy, "and put these stones around her. See if you can get some tea into her. She needs to warm her gut as well as her skin." They bundled her in furs and hot stones, and Peter propped her up in his lap so Lucy could put the mug to her lips. It seemed ludicrous with the sun so warm on his face and the heat from the stone wall at his back that Susan could still be so cold. "Should I use my cordial?" asked Lucy, and unlatched its case on her belt. "Aslan gave it to me," she explained to Bacana. "It can heal almost anything." "A gift from Aslan? That's precious indeed, girl," said Bacana, crouching next to Susan and putting a hand on her face, then her belly. "But no, I think you can save that for now. All she needs is time in the womb." An hour went by. Rhea curled up next to Susan, sharing what heat she could. Lucy hovered, still anxious to be doing something, despite Bacana's reassurances, until Bacana sent her and Edmund away to change into dry clothes. "No use, all of you, falling sick," she said, which was so much like something Mother would have said that Peter could have wept. Lucy and Edmund came back, and Edmund made Peter switch with him so Peter could go change. I know Peter had never been so grateful to have his own second-hand tunic back again, warm and dry and clean. And when Peter came out of the hall this time, Susan's eyes were open, and she was smiling at Lucy. It rained the next day, and while Peter put on a show of disappointment, he was actually grateful because he wanted Susan to have another day to rest after her ordeal. It also let them do more planning. "So, we're here then," Edmund said, tapping at the spot on the map spread out over the table. "And the care is here, and that's the stone table there. But what's all this here to the northwest? Does anyone live there?" "Dryads do," said Panna. "It's mostly woods, and then centaurs." She wrinkled her nose. "What's wrong with centaurs?" asked Lucy. "I thought we liked them." Recalled shook his head. "The northwest horde is different, barely civilized. Story is that they still use stone tools, rough country," he concluded, sitting back. "Story is," repeated Edmund quizzically. "Don't you know then?" Shrugging, Recalled shook his head again. "Got no reason to go that way, and we couldn't. Not in the snow. Like, the centaurs never come down here. Neither. They got their herds to watch, up there in the high country." The winter, Peter realized, had done more than just keep the Narnians cold and hungry. It had isolated them from one another. He didn't know whether centaurs and dwarves might have had more to do with one another otherwise, but it seemed possible. Dwarves, well, these dwarves anyway, produced silver and coal, cheese and eggs, and fish and seaweed. Surely they had something the centaurs would be interested in. And if the centaurs had herds, that meant they had cattle of some sort. They must want metal goods, mustn't they? "And what's past the hills to the north, then?" asked Susan, sweeping with her hand across the mostly unmarked area of the map. "Giants." And there was no mistaking the distaste in Recalled's voice. "We're to go there." "Oh!" said Lucy. After yesterday's excitement, she seemed a bit less enthusiastic about adventures, Peter had noticed. He doubted that would last, however. Bacana was in the doorway as Edmund asked another question. She stared at Peter and motioned with her head towards the kitchen. He glanced around, but nobody else had seen her. Muttering something about getting more tea, he climbed to his feet and padded quietly down the length of the room, ducking low to get through the doorway into the kitchen. Pakana was leaning against the counter near the enormous iron stove, her arms folded. Her blue skirts were wrinkled, the bottom hem raveling. It didn't make her any less of a presence. Peter hesitated and then sat down on the floor across from her. It was the closest he could get to equalizing their heights. "So," she said. "Queen Susan, And what are you then?" He allowed himself a smile. "Well, there are 4 thrones in Carpetbaggers." That surprised the laugh out of her. "And you would be the chief, then?" He shrugged. "Aslan called me High King, but you can keep calling me Peter if you want." "What I want," she said. "You keep asking what we want. What do you want, High King Peter of Carpetbaggers?" She said it with a smile, but there was an edge in Morgana's voice that told Peter she was not in fact jesting. The dwarves, and these dwarves in particular, are proud and skilled negotiators, had said Rhea. They are not unkind, but they want value for value, and very little comes free. Instead of answering, he posed his own question. "How long do you think it would take for us to travel all around Narnia, without stopping for too long, but not pushing too hard either?" She frowned. 2 months, maybe, if you hit all the major settlements from here to the southern border. Why? Then what I want, Grandmother Pakana, is for you to bring yourself and your best trade goods to Baruda in 10 weeks' time. Baruda? That's 5 days' travel for us. Why should we go? That's what I want, he just said. Oh, and one more thing. I know you have been fishing for years at Black Point, but the bay at the mouth of the Great River has some excellent fishing, and I understand there used to be a salt works nearby. Pakana's lips twitched. And I think that saltfish might be another thing to bring to Baruna, in as many barrels as you can fill. With that, Peter stood up and bowed formally to Pakana. She didn't smile, but her narrow eyes gleamed as she curtsied to him in return, sweeping her skirts across the smooth stone floors. She was a tiny woman in a stained blue skirt with gray shot dark braids coming undone about her shoulders and eyes the color of a mountain lake in shadow. Her voice was cracked, her hands twisted with age and scarred by hard use. And she was, he thought, also his first victory, and he loved her for it.